Yeah, so that's me. I'm an honorary research fellow in law at the university here, which sounds impressive. It just means the university don't pay me. So I do this for nothing. So that's the introduction to me done. And in terms of this talk, I'll try and explain what a citizens' jury is, why do them, how to do them, a little bit on critiques of citizens' juries, and kind of ask whether it's a useful research tool. So it's not really designed for research, but that's probably of interest to people here. And then comments and questions. Okay? So what are citizens' juries? So the easiest way for me to explain this often is to play a video, and unfortunately the technology doesn't work. So I'm going to have to go out of PowerPoint and then play my video. So the first bit of the video is a little, well, it should be self-explanatory. It's taken a citizens' jury we did 3 years ago, and then after that we fed the results into what called a post-jury workshop, where we brought together people involved in the policy area. It was about sharing health records and about who should get access to health records for what purposes. And I got the Information Commissioner there and Dame Fiona Caldicott, who's like God in the NHS when it comes to this area. And you will see them pop up at the end of the video, although they're a little quiet, especially Dame Fiona.
A citizens' jury is a method of public deliberation that invites a small cross-section of citizens, residents, or community members to learn about a topic over the course of several days, to analyze the pros and cons of different proposals, and to generate and draft their own recommendations that are aimed at solving that problem.
Public authorities that have responsibility for looking after health records have difficult decisions to make. They have to decide how much they use those records for good things like research, improving public health, but they also have to make decisions about what kind of choices to give patients to control access to their records. Surveys tell us what people think, but citizens' juries give us more than that. We can bring in experts, the jurors can ask questions, become better informed about the policy problem, and reach more informed decisions that can inform policy.
In my opinion, that's definitely changed. Just because I've learned a lot more about what actually happens.
It's not just sitting, listening to people, speakers, it's very participatory, lots of discussion, lots of time for breaks, for speaking to people. The groups have been mixed up as well, which has been good, so you're not hearing the same opinions all the time, you're meeting a different cross-section of people. It feels like I've been empowered to make a good decision based on the evidence, not on hearsay or gossip or what's written in the papers. It's more, these are the facts, this is what's real, how do you feel about that?
I'm very impressed by the work that's been done on citizens' jurors through the University of Manchester.
What I have been particularly impressed with is how open and transparent this process has been.
I think it's very interesting to see that when people have the context explained to them and understand what the safeguards are and what their rights are, they buy into the idea of patient information being shared for a greater public purpose.
Okay, so that's the video. So a little bit more on what a citizens' jury is. Hopefully that told you quite a lot in the video. So it's a form of what's called deliberative democracy. So it's a slightly different way of doing democracy, where you bring together citizens to deliberate together, not really debate. Deliberation is a more cooperative thing, and it's about people working together, listening to one another's ideas, hearing the pros and cons of different things, and working together to find solutions. And it can work in conjunction with representative democracy, but it can also work on its own. So you also may have heard of citizens' assemblies. There's been quite a lot about that in the press recently. There's been people who've been suggesting we could do a citizens' assembly on Brexit. It's probably a bit late for that now, but I'll tell you a bit more about assemblies in a minute, but basically it's just a bigger citizens' jury, citizens' panels, deliberative polling. These are all very connected things and often grouped together and called mini-publics. So citizens get chosen. Some people say they're chosen at random. I don't use that word. I don't think it's random, but quite a lot of people who run these might write letters to that's a fairly random group of people in a particular population. But who comes forward is not random. So you still get self-selection bias even when you spread your letters around in a nice random way. We don't do that. It's more expensive, and I don't think it really changes self-selection bias much. We advertise, and then we basically get a stratified sample of people. So a selection of people who we try to match against the population that we're interested in. So it might be the population of England, or it might be the population of a particular small place. So we match on gender, ethnicity, education, age, and sometimes on things like postcode, various other things we can sometimes use. The method came from a US body called the Jefferson Center. So the founder of the Jefferson Center is a guy called Ned Crosby. He did his PhD in it in the 1970s, and they went on to set up the Jefferson Center, which is a charity based in the States, and it's their method, but they let other people use it. We work with the Jefferson Center, so I work directly with them. They come over, they do more of the design. I'm getting the people in the room, like the members of the jury, expert witnesses who speak. So I'm kind of setting the thing up, but they do most of the design of the process and the delivery of that process. So I work very closely with them. So like Bruce Springsteen, it was born in the USA, but it's alive and well in various parts of the world. So heavily used in Australia, and one of the best uses, I think, of this kind of method was citizens' assembly done before the Irish referendum. So there was an assembly set up by the Irish government, so they commissioned it, and they wanted to look at various topics. And the one that's best known is they looked at abortion law, and they met together for one weekend a month for almost a year, hearing evidence on abortion to do with clinical evidence, politics. So they heard a whole range of evidence over a long period of time. And that then was fed back to the, so that's the assembly there. So 99 people plus a judge. So a judge was kind of the chair. So 99 people from across Ireland, a mixture of people. And by the end of the process, so their main task was, should they change the law on abortion, and if so, how? And by the end of the process, 87% of them voted to change the law, which was a really ideal use of citizens' juries or citizens' assemblies, in the sense that it was a very toxic issue. It was too difficult for the politicians to go near, and this came first, and they made recommendations on how the law should change. They went back to a parliamentary committee. That led to the referendum, and I'm sure most of you heard the result of the referendum. But that this was very important groundwork, and something that I think would never have probably happened had it not been for the assembly. They probably wouldn't have led to that referendum in that way. In Mongolia, they had a deliberative polling event. This is a guy called Jim Fishkin, who's a famous figure in this field from America, about and one of the things they agreed that they had to have this deliberative polling, which is another mini-public, before the country's constitution could ever be amended. So that was one of the things they agreed at this first one. And that's a picture of them. So there are over 700 people involved in this. And Genghis Khan is here looking on. I don't know what he would make of it. I don't know if that was particularly his kind of method, but anyway, he's overseeing all those 750 people. So mostly it's been used in the kind of Anglo-Saxon world, but has been used in Korea on some very important issues, Mongolia and various other places, and quite a lot in Europe as well. So why do citizens' juries? Are they researched for policy? I really think that they were designed for policy, but those first two juries, which we saw, I showed you the video for, they were really done mostly for research. After doing a PhD, I thought I'd have a go at being a postdoc in my 50s, and I applied for money to be a postdoc. It gave me no money for a citizens' jury, but that was my proposal. But I found money for a citizens' jury. I didn't get the postdoc, so I did it anyway, and that's led me here. So probably preferred to be where I am actually with the citizens' jury CIC than a postdoc. Anyway, that was done for research, but I cared about it being fed back to policy people, and I knew policy people, so I got people like the Information Commissioner and Dame Fiona Caldicott there. But they're not really designed for the research, but they can be used for research, and that's maybe something we could talk about afterwards. So I think in public policy they're mostly there to complement, most places there for complementing representative government like they've done in Ireland, and they can, I think, they particularly can add legitimacy where unelected bodies, like say health bodies, have to make decisions that affect people. And I'm going to show you an example of one we've done where that was the case. Yeah, so I think surveys, it matters what the public thinks, so I think it matters what the public think about a public policy question, even when they don't probably understand the question. So that's why surveys matter to me. But I think what we can do with things like citizens' juries is we can explain some of the complexities of a policy question, and in my experience, virtually all public policy questions are quite complicated. There's quite a lot to know about them. And it gives you an opportunity to inform people and enable them to deliberate amongst themselves and reach reasoned conclusions. So I think both things matter. So yeah, they tell us what they think when perhaps they understand the question a bit better. And people often change their minds through the process. So here's one that in one jury we did. So we started off by asking people, in fact we selected people to get a cross-section of the public. This was a survey done of like 1,500 UK adults by Ipsos Mori, and they asked this question about sharing health records. And what we were concerned about is we didn't want to get a skew group of people who are very pro-privacy or people who are very pro-information sharing. So when we recruited the jury, we asked them this question on the application form so that we got the spread that they got in the Ipsos Mori. So that's basically how people in the UK answered that question. And that's how they started in this jury in Manchester. And through the course of the jury, 13 out of 18 people changed their minds, which is, I think social psychologists say, is quite a lot. Oh, that's not right. They're meant to do very clever things, so it's not working. Okay, I must have, somehow the custom animation hasn't worked there. This is my best slide. All these people move around. It shows you how they change. Anyway, you get the gist that 13 people changed their mind and basically, oh no, they did move, didn't they? Sure. Oh, I see, it's just too fast. There they go. Okay. Ah, sorry, I ruined that. There they are, that's what happened to them. So how to do a citizens' jury. So when we do this, we usually spend quite a lot of time trying to articulate the question. So people might come with a question. So Citizens' Jury CIC, which I'm the director of, is a social enterprise which designs and runs Citizens' Jury with the Jefferson Centre. And we have to get commissions. We don't have lots of money just to do them. So people come and they have a question or questions that they want to ask. And we have to spend quite a lot of time trying to articulate those questions clearly, to make them understandable by people, to get to the right kinds of things that we can do in the amount of time and that we think will be give a real useful result for the commissioner. So that can often take quite a little bit of time. Recruiting the jury members, so we tend to go with 18 people. There's no magic to that. If it gets about 25 or above, you tend to call it citizens' assembly. So it's just a big citizens' jury. And we hire reserves because sometimes people don't show up. So I tend to pay 3 people to turn up on day 1, and they get to go home at lunchtime if we don't use them, and they get paid 75 quid for that. The other jurors get paid £100 a day. but they come along, and if we need them, they get in the jury, and if they don't, they go home at lunchtime on day one. So if people are going to leave, they tend to not turn up at the beginning, or they tend to leave on the first morning. So that's why we pay the reserves that much. So designing the jury process. Okay, so that's obviously something you've got to do. What I'd say is it's quite a skilled job. So spending several days with 18 people and getting good use of their time, and getting them to do exercises, to listen to the expert witnesses, to deliberate together. Doing that well is a skilled thing, which is why I work with the Jefferson Centre. They're very good at it, and they're very good at facilitating the jury process as well. So I think you can do it without people who've never done it before. I just think you won't do it as well. I don't think I could do it. I couldn't do it as well as they do it. And I've now been involved in 9 juries in the last 3 years. But that's not to say don't try. I just think it is skilled, so just be aware of that. I think it's very important to get impact, so whatever results, and it's important to the people on the jury that what they're doing matters. So that's why I think ideally it's not just for research. I think even if you're doing it for research, you can probably involve people involved who work in the policy area and tell them what you're doing, and they will be interested, I would think, in the results of the jury. So even if you're doing it with research, I'd urge you to think about trying to get policymakers to take note of what you're doing and the answers. And there are various variations in how you do it. I'm going to tell you about how we do it, but there's lots of variations in how you do it. I've already mentioned one thing, that we recruit usually by advertising, whereas a lot of people send letters. It's just more expensive. So as I go through, I'm going to use the example of a jury we did in the place called the Forest of Dean. Is anyone from the Forest of Dean? Just in case I get into trouble here. Okay, so it's quite a small, tight-knit place in Gloucestershire. And the background to this jury is we were called in after it was the local clinical commissioning group, who are the body responsible for commissioning healthcare, deciding what healthcare they get in the Forest of Dean, and the local care trust, who were the people who delivered services from a community hospital. They decided that they would close down 2 community hospitals, which had been there for like 100 years plus. People had raised money for. The miners over the years had gone there. There was like huge history to it. So they closed down these 2 hospitals. That was the decision to build a new one. There was a local protest group who were all against it. They would crowd-funded some money for judicial review to take it to court. So it was a very contentious thing. And you'll see a video in a moment where a guy says, from the protest group, says, they should have done the jury on that decision, on the jury of closing the 2 hospitals and building a new one. That's not what we were asked to do. We were asked to come in after that to say, where should the new hospital be built? Which was still pretty contentious. So there were 3 towns. I call them towns because they're like 8,000 to 9,000 people. They're pretty small, but they're the biggest places in the Forest of Dean. So it's going to be in one of these 3 towns, and the jury had to decide which town. So that was their job. Yeah, should it be Lydney, Cinderford, or Colford? Household names, I'm sure you all know of these places. So this is a BBC Points West came on day 1, and this is the Points West report they did on day 1 of the jury.
I wanted to get involved because I wanted to find out really what was happening, because these sort of things tend to be decisions made behind closed doors anyway. So I thought, well, if I came up here, I could perhaps have my say.
The voice of one of the citizens' jury, we were asked not to identify who was talking until the decisions have been made.
Well, it's almost a little bit of pressure because I know there's a lot of people who feel very strongly about this. But no, it's really good so that all the actual citizens of our district get to be involved in the decision making.
So over the next week, these jurors will hear presentations and quiz those involved in the new hospital plan. And with a vociferous campaign to not close the old hospitals, the jury selection process has been critical.
We basically interview everyone, we ask them questions, we ask them what they think about where the hospital should be, whether they knew about it. And in fact, when we were interviewing people, we didn't have to exclude anybody on that basis.
Those campaigning against the new hospital have welcomed the use of the citizens' jury, but say, really, it should have been part of the original consultation.
That was the main decision at the end of the day. That was the most important thing, whether we were going to close the 2 hospitals and have a new one or not. And I think that would have been a better stage in the process to have a citizens' jury, but obviously I welcome any engagement with the public at all.
So by Friday lunchtime, the citizens' jury is expected to deliver its verdict, its recommendation on where it believes the new hospital should be built. But that's not the final decision. That will be made at the end of August by the boards of the hospital trusts involved, and they may or may not agree with what the jury have decided. Either way, the new hospital to replace the Dilk here and the one at Lydney is expected to be built within 3 to 4 years' time. Steve Nibbs, BBC Points West, Cinderford.
Okay, if I can get back to my PowerPoint help. Okay, articulating the questions. Oh, I'd forgotten I'd given all this detail. I better whiz through this. I'll never get through it. Okay, so normally they're set by the commissioners of the jury. They take a while to get right, whether you're doing it for research or for policy. And in the Forest of Dean, we had one main question: should the new community hospital be built? Where should it be built? Should it be Lydney, Colford, or Cinderford? Recruiting the jury members and reserves. So I've already mentioned, should it be by advertising or mail shot? I never use the word random. I don't think it's random. You always have to think about self-selection bias. Who's going to come forward? And one of the reasons we pay people £100 a day is to reduce the self-selection bias. So when you look at the faces on the videos, there are a range of ages, there are a range of, well, you can't necessarily tell their educational background, but there are a range of social class, educational background, ethnicity, and so on. And you won't get that unless you pay people. You will tend to get people who will give you the time, who tend to be older people. Whereas what we get in terms of people who apply, we have too many young people apply, too many women apply. So we get like 60 to 65% women. We get an awful lot of people between 18 and 29. But we then pick to get our stratified sample to get a sort of group of people that represent the population, broadly represent the population. And we use the census to know what we're to compare it with. These are things we do to minimize self-selection bias. The most successful method we have for recruiting is a jobs website. So I use a jobs website called Indeed. It's not the only place to advertise, but then I use employment status to try to make sure I'm not getting bias in that way, and I'm getting just unemployed people coming along. So all kinds of people are looking for jobs. That's what you discover. People say, oh, I was looking for a job for my son, and I saw this and I thought, wow, that looks fascinating, I'll come along to that. So we don't just tend to get people looking for jobs, tend to get lots of employed people, and I control for that to make sure that's what we get. We get self-employed people and people in full and part-time employment. And in the Forest of Dean, we got a huge amount of free advertising, so we got on the radio, it was really like editorial space. We got editorial space in the local papers. We had 218 people applied. It was a 4.5-day jury, and they got £470 each. And we sampled on those things. And postcode was a really, really important thing in this jury. Like when you're trying to decide where should the new hospital be built, where people live often obviously matters. And people were very, that was the hardest thing, to try and get the match on postcode. But that's what we got. So basically that is the Forest of Dean, sort of round. Have I got a little pointy thing? Anyway, I'll do it like this. Basically round here is the Forest of Dean, and that yellow, the green up there. And I got, this went in the newspaper because people were really keen to see where did the jurors come from. So that's where they came from. And I basically matched on a mixture of the geographical spread and in population density, because it seemed to me both things mattered. So I've mentioned already, it requires skill and experience. People do a mix of work in groups together, a bit like, so we have a U shape, a bit like this. So there's some of it happening there, and there's expert witnesses standing at the front giving information. But they do a lot of group work as well in small groups, either of 3 or 6 people, usually. So really important the facilitators are independent, so you don't want to have employees who've got some vested interest in the outcome. And you may or may not want the public to observe. So it was really important in the Forest of Dean the public could observe. So we had space for them to come along and watch, and we had press and TV, which is very unusual to get TV along to something like this. It has to be something of very strong interest to local people. We had microphones, and nearly all of it was done in public. There was a few bits we thought was important to let the jury in the Forest of Dean do in private, but nearly everything was done in public. So here's the second BBC report done on the last day of the jury.
Let's keep that mindset.
After a week of hearing evidence, there were last-minute discussions.
Personally, I feel it's the weakest one of the lot.
And then the votes were cast, and then counted, and then revealed first to the jury in private, who then told us all in public.
Cinderford came out as the preferred location.
Colford and Lydney beaten by Cinderford in the heart of the forest, a decision taken by 18 people who live and work right across the district. Here are jurors Emma and Rob.
Came into this not really knowing much about either of the places because I'm from the very north of the district, and I knew that these hospitals would be far from me anyway, but I had one place in my head when I came thinking that would be a good location, and that has changed in all the data that we've had to process. It's definitely changed. Yeah, it's been tricky.
There's 18 of us in the jury, which all have differing opinions on what's important, what is less important. So it's really good to get a good cross-section of that.
The citizens' jury is an example of devolved democracy, local people having a say about what affects them. But this vote is only a preferred option. Ellen Rule is the Director of Transformation at the Gloucestershire Clinical Commissioning Group.
Well, the final decision has to rest with the organisational boards for both Gloucestershire Care Services and the Clinical Commissioning Group. But obviously we'll be taking into consideration very strongly the recommendations of the jury, and putting that together with the evidence as has been presented here will be presented to our boards as well.
Campaigners against the closure of the Dilk and Lydney hospitals are still planning a legal challenge to the plan, but have welcomed local people getting involved. Owen Adams is from the Hands Off Lydney and Dilk campaign.
We thought it was a very valuable exercise, and what ended up happening was the whole proposal was put on trial, really. We know they had to come up with an answer, and hats off to the jury. They've worked incredibly hard, and they've scrutinised this. They've given us the first public scrutiny, really, that it's had this whole issue. Ordinary people, it's been very uplifting in a way to see such sort of democracy in action.
So the question now, will the NHS stick with or go against the voice of the people when it makes the final decision?
Well, I can answer that question. They went with the voice of the people. In fact, for them it was an absolute godsend, because if they'd made that decision themselves, they would have been held for them. It was such a difficult thing for them to do. It was very difficult atmosphere in which to run the jury, because people felt so strongly about it, and there was a lot of hostility towards the two health bodies. And the fact that we could stand up and present, so I presented with one of those jurors that you saw, in fact 2 of the jurors you saw in the film. We presented what we did and the results to the 2 boards, and they voted unanimously with the majority recommendation of the jury. So getting impact is the next bit of the process. So it's important, especially for policy juries, but even I think for research juries, I'd recommend it. It will make the jurors more committed to what they're doing if they think someone's going to do something with it. And what is, I think, very striking if you go and watch, and Emma came to one last week, or 2 weeks ago, I don't know if you think this, Emma, but people take their job terribly seriously. So they become a little bit like mini policymakers. And part of the reason for that is that they think that what they're doing matters. And for it to matter, I think it needs to have some kind of impact. And one thing you can do, and this is what I was talking about a little bit earlier, we have these things called post-jury workshops where I get together maybe 10 of the jurors, or half the jurors perhaps, plus people involved in policy who've commissioned the jury, or even if they've not commissioned the jury, people involved in this policy area, academics, and we then present together what we did and what we found, and then we usually do some kind of group work with mixing up the jurors and the policy people about what should happen next, what should happen to the result that came out of the jury, what action should be taken. And in the Forest of Dean, we presented the findings to the two boards, and they unanimously backed it. What if they hadn't? So I think I put that in as a little reminder. So I think one example, if they'd had lots and lots of recommendations, it might be that the bodies that commissioned it, who are accountable for the decisions, they might have gone with some of the recommendations and not others. That's not unusual. So in Melbourne, they had a citizens' assembly which was about prioritising the budget, a £5 billion Australian dollar budget, which is about £2.5 billion, 10-year budget, and they made 15 recommendations about how to prioritise it. And I think the council, Melbourne City Council, went with something like 12 of them, but they justified why they didn't go to the other 3. So I think it sort of demands a response. It doesn't necessarily demand the accountable body follows absolutely everything they do, in my view. Some people argue that it should. I wouldn't necessarily, but I think they have to respond to everything and justify maybe why they're not going with it. Critiques of citizens' jury, well, it is just a small sample of unelected people. That is true. It's more qualitative than quantitative in that sense. And that's one reason why I think I don't see them as decision-making bodies. I see them as advisory bodies. They're never perfectly representative. You don't get perfect representation. And there's a potential for bias. So, and that can be conscious or unconscious bias. So just in thinking which expert witnesses you choose, what slides they make, the expert witnesses, how they pick their information, lots and lots of, the kind of exercise you run, all kinds of little tiny conscious and unconscious decisions that get made could be seen as biased. So we have what we try to do is just try and monitor, minimize it, and report it, because I don't think you get rid of it. So in the Forest of Dean, for instance, we had a 3-person panel who weren't really Forest of Dean. They didn't have a vested interest. And they firstly reviewed the design of the jury and the questions the jury were looking at and so on. And then they reviewed all the slides that the jury saw in advance. And then their feedback, I take it back to the witnesses and get them to change their slides. So the idea is to make them balanced. We have questionnaires of the jurors every day to ask them whether they see bias, and we report that. It's important to try and keep the funders a bit independent from the process. That's sometimes quite difficult to do when they're paying for it. But there was quite a lot of critique of one of the Labour governments who were quite keen on citizens' juries, that people said that they'd get the result they wanted. They'd often hire big management consultancy firms, and they would come along and somehow deliver the result that the government wanted. So trying to keep the funder at arm's length and not get too involved in the process is an important thing to try to do. The jurors with us write the reports, essentially, so a lot of the material they're putting on flip charts, a lot of their group work leads to reasons, for instance, so they come up with reasoned conclusions, and then they vote on what are the most important reasons, and all that gets into a report which gets shown to them on the last day and gets basically, it's their report, so that gets published pretty much immediately. And then pretty much we try nearly everything that moves. All of the documentation gets put on a website so that anyone can look at it. So that's what we try to do. Is it a useful research tool? So I think it is a means to find out what an informed public think. It's certainly good qualitative data. I think the difficulty for me in using it for research is that I think it is a skilled process, and it's not that, it's not that researchers haven't got skills. Of course they have, but if you're not doing a lot of these, it's quite difficult to do. It's relatively time-consuming and costly as a research tool as well. So that paying the jurors. So in a 3-day jury, I reckon it's about 60 days' work in total. That's not the jurors' work. That's our work, the facilitator. It's quite a lot of work involved. And I mentioned before, the juror experience is stronger where they have impact. Oh, and at the end, so I always give them a little questionnaire, and one of the things I say is, tell us about your experience. And people get an awful lot out of doing it. That is true. So the big words are the ones that lots of people said. And it's a very rewarding thing to do. People get a lot out of it. I think in our life we're not used to having so much effort put into informing us, and people aren't usually that interested in what we think. So for ordinary people to be involved in something like that, they usually get a lot out of it. So there's a lot more I could tell you. My wife, though, has explained to me that not everybody is as interested in this as I am. That's her after just 10 minutes. So I'm going to stop there. And there's a couple of references. Oh, and another thing you might want to watch, or listen to, sorry, is last week's Radio 4 analysis program was on deliberative democracy, which is citizens' juries, citizens' assemblies, and so on.